Are you going to start the webinar?
Yes, we can now start. So you're most welcome. Thank you all for taking your time to join us in this year's USSP conference, PopPov. This is the second PopPov that we're having as a panel. And I have one of my colleagues from the panel, from the PopPov panel that has been part of the organizing committee for this conference, Marilyn Lee. You're most welcome. And all our speakers, you're also very, very welcome. We have 3 papers that we'll go through in today's session. The first is by Alev Gabuz Kuner. I hope I did pronounce. You'll help me with the correct pronunciation. And Alev is a research analyst at the World Bank in the Africa region, Gender Innovative Lab. And her primary interests are development economics, applied microeconomics, but she also has interest in agriculture economics. And then we also have Bablawende Jean Kabore. You're most welcome. He describes himself as an economist, data scientist, and now he's based at the University of Houston. And then the third paper is by Willa Friedman. She's an assistant professor of economics at the University of Houston, and she studies development issues in development economies as well as political economy. So we'll have our first presenter, and the first presenter, these are recorded sessions, but then you can post your questions or your comments in the Q&A. So as the recording goes on, whatever questions that will be arising, these will be responded to either directly through the Q&A or after the session that we have, but do not post any questions in the chat room because we'll have our focus in the Q&A. So we'll go forth with the first presentation, which is a psychosocial and economic impact of a mental health intervention for violence survivors in Eastern DRC. You're most welcome, Alev. Please take the floor.
I would like to correct that the presenter is Julia Violent, my co-author.
I am a senior economist at the World Bank, the Africa Gender Innovation Lab. Today I'm going to present to you the results from a study of narrative exposure therapy, which is a mental health intervention for women survivors of violence in Eastern DRC. So the context of Eastern DRC, as we may know, is one of high rates of sexual and gender-based violence, with 27% of women having experienced sexual violence at some point in their lives, and 57% of women who experience physical or sexual violence. And this is in the context, especially in Eastern DRC, North and South Kivu, where we did this study, of persistent conflict and insecurity with the civil war that started in 1995, that led to large-scale civilian deaths and displacements, and what this conflict is sadly known for, systematic violence against women and girls, especially systematic sexual violence committed at the hands of armed forces, with reports of atrocities committed. And so these survivors of these violence are at high risk of psychological distress and mental disorders, and there are high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in the region. However, there are limited services to support those survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. There is a scarcity of adequately trained mental health service providers when the need for those mental health services is pressing, especially for low-cost services that work in low-income and post-conflict settings. One of the contributions of this study is to show that psychotherapy can work in this context. The second contribution is to contribute to the growing literature on the association between mental health and economic outcomes in low and middle income countries. And there've been some mixed findings on this association, but in quantitative study, usually there's a consistent negative relationship between labor market outcomes and mental health. But little is known on the causal relationship between mental health and economic outcomes. Which direction does the causality go into? And one of the aims of this study is to see whether through the improvement in mental health, we also have an improvement in economic empowerment, which would help sort of uncover the direction of this causality. Narrative exposure therapy is a psychotherapy that was delivered as a component of a World Bank funded project, the Great Lakes Emergency Sexual and Gender-Based Violence and Women's Health Project, which was implemented by the government of the DRC. The government of the DRC procured the services of an international, actually a German NGO called Vivo International, who designed NET, trained the counselors, and did the supervision of NET delivery. What is NET? NET is a short-term individual psychotherapy which aims to address trauma in survivors of violence, and in this situation, survivors of sexual violence in North and South Kivu. NET recognizes that survivors of trauma may have undergone multiple distressing events within their lifetime, and it focuses on the traumatic events and helps construct a narrative, a chronological narrative of a patient's life. And this narrative is structured with the assistance of the therapist to help overcome the trauma and the PTSD symptoms and other mental health disorders. In this project, NET was delivered both through the health system, so by nurses in Hill Africa, which is a center of excellence in Goma in North Kivu, and in health centers in the health zones in rural areas. It was also delivered by psychosocial assistants in community-based organizations, and psychosocial assistants are lay people, they are not healthcare professionals. This is really important because we will be able to see whether NET works as well when it's delivered by healthcare professionals as it is when it's delivered by non-professionals. This is important to know whether the treatment is effective, what kind of delivery mode is effective, and what's the potential for scale of a treatment such as NET in a conflict-affected country that has very low resources. In addition, NET is really appropriate for this context because of its narrative features and because it requires no particular level of literacy. So we want to know what's the impact of narrative exposure therapy on female survivors' mental health in Eastern DRC in the short term, whether this impact is durable in the long term, whether through an improvement in mental health, there is also an improvement in women's economic empowerment and other psychosocial outcomes in the medium term, and what's the differential impact of NET when delivered by healthcare professional versus lay people. To measure the impacts of NET, we ran a randomized controlled trial where the treatment group received NET, so individuals randomized into treatment received NET. And in the control group, they received the standard of care provided in the Great Lakes Project, which is basically psychosocial support in community-based organizations. They were offered other support services. The treatment group also was offered those other support services. And the control group was waitlisted to receive NET until after NLine, which is currently happening. We collected data at baseline on over 1,000 women between June 2017 and October 2019. This is a very long baseline because we recruit women for the study as they go to the health center to receive services. So this is a study done by cohort, and randomization is done within each cohort. Midline was done 3 months after NET delivery for each cohort, and there we expect to find short-term effects. And N-line was collected 12 months after NET delivery. So N-line is expected to be completed in January 2021, and so far we've collected 70% of the sample, which means that all of the N-line results we will show you should be considered preliminary since they are done only on a partial sample. We will be looking primarily at our mental health outcomes, so measures of PTSD and measures of depression and anxiety, which we expect to move significantly in the short term within 3 months of delivery of NET. And we'll also look at secondary outcomes, economic empowerment indicators, and other psychosocial outcomes, which we expect to move in the medium term, so 12 months after delivery of NET. All right, so let's jump directly into results. What do we find? We find that that narrative exposure therapy significantly improves post-traumatic stress disorder and depression and anxiety, as shown by those graphs, which show the scores for both of those disorders at midline and at endline. What do we see? We see that when a survivor receives NET, her PTSD score and her depression and anxiety score is significantly lower than in the control group for those who did not receive NET. We also use probable PTSD and probable depression and anxiety, which are binary outcomes. So you have probable PTSD if your PTSD score is over 1.75. We see significant negative impacts on probable PTSD with a 15% lower probability of having PTSD when you receive NET compared to being in the control group, and a 9% lower probability of suffering from depression or anxiety. Looking at psychosocial outcomes, we see that receiving NET significantly increases the participants' self-esteem. However, that is the only psychosocial outcome that actually has a significant impact thanks to NET in this study. But again, these are preliminary results with only 70% of the sample. So we don't see any significant impacts, for example, on the local functioning impairment index or on the other psychosocial outcomes, management of problems, self-care, etc. Regarding economic empowerment, we do not see any again, preliminary results, but we don't see any significant difference between the treatment and the control group on labor force participation, as shown in the left-hand side graph. Almost everybody works. That's a really notable finding, I think, from this study, even from the baseline, with those very high rates of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. The women in our sample are still almost 90% or even over 90% of them actually worked in the last 7 days. But we are seeing signs that receiving NET decreases the number of hours worked in the last 7 days, which was kind of a surprising result for us. So we're still exploring this particular finding, trying to understand what it means that they're working less. We also find signs of increase in savings probability, so the probability that the participant is saved any money in the past 6 months, and a decrease in her partner's participation in childcare, which we interpret as being due to the fact that when her mental health improves, she is more able to take care of her children, and then her partner who was helping out sort of pulls back on the help and the sharing of those tasks. All right, and now jumping to the heterogeneity analysis by delivery mode. So does it work as well when it's delivered by healthcare professionals in health centers or by psychosocial assistants who are not healthcare professionals in community-based organizations? Well, what we find is that NET improves PTSD and depression and anxiety significantly only when it's delivered in CBOs. And that result was true at midline and significant and seems to hold at endline. So far from the sample we are seeing that at endline also. So to sum up, NET improves symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and anxiety, and self-esteem. It is too early to conclude on economic empowerment, but we are seeing some unexpected effects on hours worked, with a decrease in the number of hours worked by women who receive NET. And we're seeing that NET has a significant impact only when it's delivered in community-based organizations. So the main takeaways from this study is that, first of all, this is a psychotherapy that works in a low-income, low-literacy, conflict-affected setting with high levels of trauma. Those effects are significant, they're sustained over time, and this is a really important finding. Operationally, at the World Bank, I often hear that from partners in the field, I often hear psychotherapy is not adapted to our low-income, conflict-affected context. Well, narrative exposure therapy absolutely works in this setting. It works when non-professionals deliver it, and perhaps it works even much better than when professionals deliver it. This is an important result for scalability, since there is a scarcity of trained mental health professionals in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Finally, we are seeing some still unclear links between mental health and economic empowerment, which we will be exploring in future work. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions, comments, suggestions, recommendations.
Thank you so much for our first presentation. Now we'd like to go on to the second one, which is the effect of women's employment on intimate partner violence in West Africa. You're most welcome, Kabore.
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Jean Kabore. I'm a graduate student at the University of Houston. Today, I will be presenting research on the effects of women's employment on intimate partner violence in West Africa. The motivation for this project stems from the fact that domestic violence against women is a widespread phenomenon. It affects 1 out of 3 women of age 15 and over worldwide. The cost of IPV exceeds 5% of the world GDP, and World Health Organization estimates that the rate of domestic violence in Africa is about 36.6%. And their assessment is that its prevalence is due to weak bargaining power within the household for women. And the cost of IPV in sub-Saharan Africa amounts to almost 15% of the regional GDP. Figure 1 shows the global prevalence of intimate partner violence. And so, as you can see, even in high-income countries and in the West, domestic violence is still extremely high. So the research question that I seek to answer is, what are the effects of women's employment on the experiences of intimate partner violence? Previous research have found that women's employment can lead to higher bargaining power, which decreases domestic violence within the household. Where others have shown that women's employment can actually lead to male backlash and therefore increase violence. For instance, women's employment can be perceived as a threat to traditional male dominance in patriarchal societies. It can also be that men are trying to use instrumental violence to try to extract resources from their working wife, which can also lead to violence. Exposure also plays a significant role in women's experience of domestic violence. For instance, employed women can reduce their exposure to any potential abusive partner at home by just simply working outside of the home. So as you can see, in the literature, there is no consensus as to what are the effects of women's employment on intimate partner violence. And part of the problem is that women's employment and their experiences of domestic violence is both endogenous to family structure and societal norms where they live. So what I do in this paper is to use dust pollution shocks, which negatively affect women's employment, in order to see how women's employment affect intimate partner violence. Excuse me. So figure 2 shows dust pollution in West Africa. In the first figure, you see that these men were caught unexpectedly by dust storms and they had to pull over. This type of sudden dust events disrupt economic activities. And in a figure below, that's a map of dust pollution and also a global map of dust pollution. If you look at West Africa, some of the world's polluted areas do not even have people living in them. So that means that dust pollution is not a man-made phenomenon. So yes, dust pollution is seasonal. In West Africa, it is seasonal, but conditional on its seasonality, its severity and deviation from the normal patterns that the population has come to expect and strategically prepare for cannot be timed by the population. As you can see, it's like a random walk, and therefore conditional seasonality, it is exogenous. And this is the identification strategy that I will be using in this paper. So if you are working in these local markets, and you are caught unexpectedly by this sudden dust spell event, like these women who sell food and provide services, it can be disruptive to your daily activities and even your income. So any type of job that is vulnerable to dust, sudden dust spell events can be disrupted with this dust pollution. Just to look at the big picture, figure 5 shows the women's and men's employment and dust pollution. The y-axis to the left, I have employment in percentage, and the y-axis to the right, I have dust concentration, and the x-axis is the amount of interview. So this figure shows that there's a strong negative correlation between women's employment and dust pollution in West Africa. And for men's employment, we can see that it is irresponsive to actual dust pollution and stays steady throughout the year. So when we look at intimate partner violence, figure 6 shows the acceptance and justification of intimate partner violence. So the y-axis to the left, I have the percentage of people who justify or accept violence. The y-axis to the right is the dust concentration, and the x-axis is the amount of interview. Again, there is a positive correlation between women's acceptance of domestic violence and men's justification of domestic violence with dust pollution patterns. We look at women's actual experience of intimate partner violence in figure 7. We also see that all the acts of domestic violence that women are experiencing follows the have similar patterns and are strongly positively correlated with dust pollution pattern in West Africa. The data that I will be using for this project comes from the DSS. I will be using the individual women's files, which interviews women of age 15 to 49. The male's files interviews men of age 15 to 59, and the dust pollution data is monthly dust concentration from 1986 to 2006. And the data has been provided by advisor to my advisor, William Friedman, who will be presenting shortly after me. Advisor and Koto, they use this same dust pollution data to study its effect on child health outcomes in West Africa, in the same countries that I'm studying, which are enumerated in the footnote below. So the methodology is to use a repeated cross-sectional data model with region, country, and time-fixed effect, whereby in the first stage, I'm going to look at how dust pollution affects employment for individual I who lives in cluster V, region R, country C, who was interviewed in month M and year T. And that is the dust concentration. X is a vector of individual and household characteristics. Delta CMB is a country by month fixed effect to control for seasonal variation across countries. A region fixed effect on gamma RC to control for an observable driver of the outcome that happen to be correlated with dust over space, and a year fixed effect in theta T to control for economic activities that can affect the whole of West Africa. Epsilon is an error term that is closer at the dust point. So in the reduced form, I'll be doing the same thing by looking at how dust pollution affects intimate partner violence. So in the first stage, I will show you results of the effect of dust pollution on women's and men's employment. The outcome in column 1 is an indicator of women's employment status in the month that they were interviewed. And in column 2, it's an indicator of employment status a year from the time that they were interviewed. And dust pollution here is the dust pollution, the dust concentration in the month that they were interviewed. So a standard deviation above the mean of dust pollution exposure leads to women being 7 percentage points less likely to be working. And as you can see, there is really no effect on the employment status a year before the interview. For men, I do not see any effect of dust pollution on their economic activities such as employment. So in the reduced form, I will be showing you the effect of dust pollution on acceptance and justification of intimate partner violence and the effect of dust pollution on women's experience of intimate partner violence. So figure 2 shows the effect of dust pollution on acceptance and justification of intimate partner violence. And the question is whether a man is justified in beating his wife if she goes out without telling him, neglects the kids, argues with her husband, refuses to have sex with her husband, burns the food that she's cooking. And RPV index is an index that I created using the 5 variables that I just talked about. So a standard deviation above the mean of dust pollution exposure leads to women being 9 percentage points more likely to justify and accept violence if a wife goes out without telling her husband. They are 19.4 percentage points more likely to accept violence if a wife refuses to have sex with her husband, and 10 percentage points more likely to accept violence overall if a wife goes in the IPV index. As for men, a standard deviation above the mean of that exposure leads to them being 19 percentage points less likely to justify violence if a wife goes out without telling her husband, 20 percentage points less likely to justify violence if a wife neglects the kids, and 15 percentage point more likely to justify violence if the wife refuses to have sex with her husband. Figure table 3 shows the effect of dust pollution on women's experience of intimate partner violence. In column 1, I have an indicator of women's experience of any acts of violence, as I have shown in the previous figure, any acts of violence. And column 2 is the intensity of the violence. Can be, if they experience 1 act of violence, it would take 1. If they experience 2, 3, it would be 2, 3, etc. to 7. And violence index is just an index of using all the acts of experience of violence constructed using principal component analysis. So a standard deviation above the mean of dust pollution leads to women being 22 percentage points more likely to have experienced any acts of violence, 0.43 increase in the intensity of violence, and 0.73 increase in violence index. As for the mechanism, a standard deviation above the mean of dust pollution leads to a significant decrease in women's ability to financially participate in household expenses. I also see that there is a significant decrease in their bargaining power within the household, and a significant increase in their in time spent at home, and the likes of the breastfeeding more at home, watching TV more, and also engaging in sexual activity, all of which can lead to more exposure to any potential abusive partner at home. As for health outcomes, I do not see any effect of dust pollution on health outcomes. I would stop here, and I will be happy to take any questions, suggestions, or contribution to the project. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kavore, for your presentation. Now I'd like to welcome Willa for a presentation on evolution of cultural attitudes and gender of children in West Africa. You're most welcome, Willa.
Hi, and thanks for being here. I'm Willa Friedman. I'm at the University of Houston in economics. This project is joint with Jean Kavore, who is likely in this room. He's also my excellent, fantastic, wonderful PhD student. And anything good about this project is attributable to him. Anything else, you can lay that on me. I'm going to talk today about the evolution of cultural attitudes in children's gender in West Africa. So I'll tell you where this data comes from in a second, but for now we see 19% of fathers in West Africa report that a man is justified in beating his wife if she goes out without telling him, and 9% say that it's justified if she burns the food. Looking at the same questions among mothers, we see that 43% report that a man's justified in beating his wife if she goes out without telling him, and 22% report that it's justified if she burns the food. Notably, the responses are higher with higher levels of justification of domestic violence among mothers than among fathers. We also see that 22% of mothers report experiencing some form of intimate partner violence, including either sexual violence or other forms of physical violence. So our question today is how and why do cultural attitudes change or not change? And do parents choose attitudes on behalf of their children? So there's previous literature that finds that yes, indeed, parents do seem to be changing their views in response to the gender of their children. So there's evidence that daughters increase voting for pro-women policies among US politicians, daughters decrease support for female genital cutting among parents in Egypt, and adolescent sons increase father sexual activity in a sample of 37 countries. But not always, so there's some complications. So there's one paper that finds that sons don't seem to change at all women's bargaining power in India, and another finds that daughters increase women's bargaining power plus the work in their work in consumption in a sample in India and Bangladesh. At the same time, there's this growing strand of literature, some of which we're going to hear about today, on what increases, not the same as causes, increases intimate partner violence. I think we're seeing pretty clearly now with a range of evidence that material well-being in some form, cash transfers, does seem to reduce intimate partner violence. However, there's also a backlash when those resources are specifically targeted at women. We see that I think a growing body of evidence showing that resources targeted at women can sometimes result in increased intimate partner violence experienced by that woman. So what do we do? So we're going to compare reported attitudes specifically towards domestic violence and related to women's empowerment of parents of boys and parents of girls. We're going to use 436,000 demographic and health survey respondents in West Africa, 343,000 mothers and 93,000 fathers. This is from 12 countries and 48 surveys. We're going to treat the gender of the child as plausibly random. Now, given what this conference is about, I'm sure many of you have reasons to believe that this might not always be the case. We think in this context, this is at least reasonable assumption. This is a context in which there's very limited access to ultrasounds. I've seen little to no reporting of sex-selective abortions in West Africa, and very, very limited access to IVF. So we do see a relatively balanced sex ratio at birth, which is something that you don't see in contexts in which there's high reports of sex-selective abortions. We're going to use only the first 2 children for most of what I'll show you, although we get very similar results when we include all of the rest of the children. But for the first 2 children, in contexts where we do see a lot of sex-selective abortions, we don't see that happening as much for the first births. We see it more for later births. But differential stopping rules could still change who has sons and who has daughters, even without changing the overall sex ratio. So this doesn't seem to be as common in West Africa as it is in other places. And one bit of evidence of that is that we see among all of the families, we see 15% have only daughters and 16% have only sons. Now 16 is bigger than 15, but it's a very small difference. And so we don't see a ton of differential stopping of people continuing to have kids when they have daughters until they have a son, but stopping as soon as they have a son or a couple of sons. So we're going to compare families with only girls compared with families of only boys among families who have only 1 or 2 children, okay? Other comparisons that we can do look very, very similar, but we're not going to report that in the interest of time today. So our key outcome variables are stated support for intimate partner violence. And so this all takes the form of, is it justified if a man beats his wife if she X? And there are 5 different X's that we'll show you. And then there are a set of empowerment related questions, which is who in your family has the household say on some household decision. And then we've got 2 tangible outcomes. One is, are you in a polygamous marriage? And 2, are you divorced? So then we're also going to, we ran a similar survey, or we ran a survey with 1,000 respondents in the US, where we asked a similar set of questions, and we're going to report the same differences for that sample in just a second. So first, for the West Africa survey, so this is reporting for mothers. The green bars are for parents of only boys, and the orange are for parents of only girls, so 1 or 2 daughters. And what we see in each of these sets is the reporting of, is it justified if a man beats his wife if she goes out without telling her husband, neglects the children, argues with the husband, refuses sex with the husband, burns food while cooking? So I'm going to tell you none of these differences are statistically significant, and this is what we see across all of the different ways of running this comparison of parents of sons and parents of daughters. And if anything, we see among parents of daughters, we see a slight increase in justification of domestic violence, okay? So for each of these, we see, if anything, the difference is small, but if anything, parents of daughters are justifying greater levels of intimate partner violence than parents of sons. So this is for mothers. Now we see the same thing for fathers. And again, we see these very small differences, again, not statistically significantly different. And if anything, more justification of intimate partner violence for fathers of daughters than for fathers of sons. When we look at mothers' experience of intimate partner violence, we see those who have daughters are experiencing slightly more, but these differences are not statistically significant. Some of these gaps may look a little bit bigger than they did in the past, but it's just that these are smaller numbers, and so it stretches things out. Since we've seen previous research on support for the continuation of practice of female genital mutilation, female genital cutting, we look at this with the sample of mothers, and again with the sample of fathers. And again, we see small, not statistically significant differences. If anything, more support for the continuation of female genital cutting among parents of daughters than among parents of sons. So this is for mothers. Now the same thing for fathers. So if we look at bargaining power in the household, so this is in response to a question of who has the final say over own healthcare, large household purchases, daily household purchases, family visits. This is a 1 indicates saying either that I have full control or that we share control, and a 0 indicates that the other person has the final say. So again, we see very small and not statistically significant gaps between these. The one place that we do see a statistically significant gap is in the likelihood of polygamous marriage. And so mothers of daughters are significantly more likely to be in a polygamous marriage than mothers of sons. Fathers, we see exactly the same thing, small, not statistically significant differences, but there is a gap in the likelihood of polygamous marriage. So as I mentioned, we see very similar results when we do different kinds of comparisons using all children, using only first children, using the fraction female, fraction male. We see small and very close to 0 differences between parents of sons and parents of daughters in the reporting about intimate partner violence and other gender related views. We also run a set of specifications where we control for a whole bunch of demographic characteristics, background that we know, and again, we see very little gap. So one possible explanation is that this is something about status, right? There's something about having daughters that changes status, and in response to the change in status, there could be different justifications for intimate partner violence. So we decided to look at this in a sample in the US. So we ran a survey with a very similar set of questions. This is a context in which the gender of child confers a lot less status. And there are a lot more families that have children of only one gender because of smaller family sizes. So we got 1,000 respondents. This is an online survey. We get people's views on intimate partner violence using the exact same questions as we have in West Africa, and views on empowerment using a sort of adjusted set of survey questions that have previously been used in different contexts. And then at the end of the survey, we asked about the age and gender of children, along with a whole bunch of demographic characteristics. And we hope that this means that nobody really has a guess of what it is that we're looking for in this survey while they're filling it out. So now we're going to compare parents of only daughters, only sons, and both. So here we see very, very large gaps. So here, this is the exact same questions that we saw in the DHS sample. Is a man justified in beating his wife if she goes out without telling her husband, neglects the children, argues with the husband, refuses sex with the husband, or burns food while cooking? And here we see for fathers and for mothers and overall, we see that parents of sons are much more likely to justify intimate partner violence than parents of daughters. When we look at the empowerment questions, we see the same thing. We see larger justification of more empowerment for men relative to women within a household among parents of sons than of parents of daughters. So we see a higher fraction of parents of sons, both fathers and mothers, reporting that a man is justified in keeping his partner from seeing her friends, restricting the partner from contact with family, insisting on knowing her whereabouts, getting angry if the partner speaks with another man, expecting the partner to ask permission for healthcare, and if he does, and also being justified if he does not trust the partner with money. What we see in this and the previous tables is that parents who have kids of both genders seem to be reporting more similarly to parents with only sons. We also asked a set of questions about allocation of limited opportunities, so jobs and schooling. And here we see that parents of sons relative to parents of daughters are more likely to say that men have more rights to jobs than women when jobs are scarce. Men are better political leaders than women. College is more important for men than for women, and to support preferential hiring and promotion for women. So in this sample, now we're seeing large gaps. So you might worry that children's gender could be a little bit more endogenous in the US. IVF is still rare. You know, I think we're almost to 2%, but that's still going to be that can't be enough to explain this difference. sex-selective abortions, there is evidence of these happening in the US, but it's limited to a very, very small subset of the population. So again, this can't explain the large gaps that we're seeing in reported differences. You might worry that fathers are less likely to participate in their daughters' lives. There's evidence that having a daughter compared to having a son means that either an unmarried couple is less likely to get married, or a married couple is more likely to split up. We see the same results for mothers, and so that can't be driving what we're seeing here. So there's some implications. One implication is that adults' beliefs are not completely fixed. Since we've shown this for clearly gender-related attitudes, I'm curious whether we can sort of use this as a measure of how people perceive a policy's benefit for men versus for women. And then one implication is that as family sizes in some cases, in some contexts get smaller, you could increase the divergence in views, as some people have only sons and some people have only daughters. But it's still an open question. We've done a little bit to explore this, but I would love to hear your thoughts about why we're getting such different results for the US and West Africa. Thanks for being here, and I will talk to you in the chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Willa, for your presentation. Now we'll go into this session where we'll invite each of the speakers to discuss the other's paper, and would like to welcome you, Willa, to discuss the first paper, which was on the psychosocial and economic impact of mental health. Willa, you're most welcome.
Thanks so much. Julia, Leah, and Alev, this paper was really delightful to read. I have a long email that I will send to you with a bunch of little nitpicky updates to make, but I think that this already is very interesting, and I think it has a lot of potential. So what I'm going to talk about now is really sort of how to put it together and how to spin it and how to present this. So I think that there is a bunch of work on mental health interventions using experiments in developing countries, and it's really, really small and really new literature. And when I was first reading your paper, I thought, oh, they haven't seen these papers, great, I'll send them. But actually, a lot of them are in your citations list, and so you know them. And so I would make those really prominent. I think it's a really exciting, very well published set of studies. And I think you guys should jump right in. I think what you are doing is absolutely a huge contribution to what's already been done in that area. And so basically you can show some people have done some experiments trying out different interventions, but there's still a huge amount that we don't know. And one of those things is something that I think you in this project are able to answer. So I think it's amazing and fascinating and important that you see evidence that non-professional health practitioners can provide this service in a way that is very effective. And so I think one of the hesitations and one of the limits of how big the mental health interventions in developing countries can get is they tend to be very, very expensive. And with the very limited budgets that a lot of countries have and health service systems have, it's harder to justify. And so if you can show that there is a way that you can get very similar, or at least very, very big, strong results when delivered by a population that is not the limited set of health service providers that already exist, and doesn't require taking them away from provision of other kinds of care that we think of as super important, but that you could train a new set of people to deliver these services. To me, even if there's, I believe, having read your paper, that there's a much higher chance of this, but even if there's a 5% chance that that's true, I think that needs to justify millions of dollars of research funding for the next interventions. And so I would really, really encourage you to stress that bit, to say, we've seen that mental health interventions work in some developing countries and have these important long-term effects or short-term, medium-term effects. We show that that's true with a different kind of intervention that is maybe even better targeted, and it can be delivered in this way that has the potential to be really, really inexpensive. And even though I think, in the way that it's presented in the paper and a little bit in the way that it's presented today, I think you're being a little bit hesitant about that. And I respect that you're being a little bit hesitant about that, because some of your findings are just totally airtight. And this one is, I see that it's like strongly suggestive and it's enough that I'm convinced, but I think I see why you're trying to not push too hard on it. But I think it is so important to have that out there, even just as a like strongly suggestive hypothesis, that there are then future experiments that try to do this with untrained folks. And I think the other reason that I think that this could be very important is it's a great justification for why economists specifically are working on this question. I don't know if some of you are trained actually as mental health providers. I don't think that you are. But I think it's a real justification for why economists are doing the experiment of we're going to try this mental health intervention and see if we get mental health effects, because we're thinking about how to sort of have all of these service provisions with limited budgets. So anyway, I'll send you a bunch of silly details, but I really enjoyed this. And I think everybody should do the follow-up paper to this. Thanks. I think I'm out of time.
Thank you so much, Willa. Yeah, that's
Thanks, Willa.
Your comments are very valuable, and thank you very much. I do hope they've taken some notes from that. Now I would like to have your thoughts, Alev, on the second paper, which was the effect of women's employment on intimate partner violence in West Africa. Please go ahead, Alev.
Okay, thank you, Esther, for making this happen. So I'm Olive, and I work at the World Bank with my co-authors. And I want to thank John for your presentation and sharing your work with us. So I will briefly discuss your paper in the next couple of minutes. So I really enjoyed reading your paper, where you aim to look at the impacts of women's employment status on intimate partner violence in this area, its acceptance, justification, and also discussing the mechanisms through which this effect might be happening. And I have two main points that I would like to address. And first of all, I think the idea of using dust pollution is very, very cool and interesting. And your findings that we see this relationship between dust pollution and employment status for women only, but we do not observe it for men, is actually very, very important. So it makes the reader ask the question why this is the case and why we have such gender differences, right, in this association. So I think it would be a great contribution if you could discuss this in your paper, why we see this negative relationship only for women. Is it, for example, due to occupation segregation? Is it due to social norms or anything else? I think it's important to argue why women are impacted from this environmental event, but not men. And I think it will be helpful to discuss these, especially if you like to have some policy recommendations with this study. And my second point is coming to your main research question, which is what are the effects of employment on IPV? So as you also mentioned in your paper, that it's hard to answer these questions because of the nature of the endogenous nature of employment to IPV measures, right? And I believe that if you can discuss in your study, in your methodology, the exogeneity of another variable, which is the dust pollution in your case, if you can discuss that and have a strong argument, then you can use it as an instrument and easily identify the causal effects of employment on IPV measures, which is the main question you have. So I think your methodology can definitely be like supported in this way. And if you hold an argument for the randomness of dust pollution in this setting, and so you can like substitute your first stage estimations in your structural model, and you can answer that question. Right now, the estimations you have are checking the impact of dust pollution on and employment on IPV. So I think you can support that. So these are the points I want to address. It's great to read this paper, and I'm open to discuss further in the Meet the Others session. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so
You're
much.
most welcome. Thank you so much. Now we'd like to welcome Julia. You're most welcome to discuss the last paper, which is evolution of cultural attitudes and gender of children in West Africa.
Thanks, Esther. Thanks, Esther. Thanks, Willa and Jean. And thank you, Willa, for your really nice comments and really useful comments on our paper. So on your paper, you look at a really interesting question, which I thought it was a really cool research question, whether the gender of your children changes your acceptance of intimate partner violence, and then doing this comparison between West Africa and the US is also really neat. I have one sort of, and I guess I'm not super familiar with the theory behind what shapes acceptance of violence and attitudes around violence. So I guess I have a bit of a theoretical problem with what's the mechanism for women to change their acceptance of IPV when they have daughters. This would imply that their preference for their daughter's welfare is significantly higher than their preference for their own welfare, right? Which is possible. I'm not a mother yet, but I don't really know, but it seems like a strong assumption. So I would really, and I totally realize that your paper was preliminary, but that's a theoretical discussion that really needs to happen in the paper. And also, because you're comparing the two settings where you find such different results, that the only conclusion must be that the pathways to how your attitudes around violence must be different in those two settings. And so again, that calls for a much bigger, much more in-depth discussion of the theory behind those attitudes. I think the more of a framework. I would really like to see like a next version of the paper with more of a framework about that. My second main comment was, in the West Africa sample, you actually see slightly higher acceptance of violence when they have girls, which she says not significant, but it is slightly higher for every single question. So I wonder if you put that in score or an index, whether you might actually get some significance. You may also want to look at it by country. I don't know if there's actually a chat or a Q&A going on, but Leah and I were just, Leah, sorry, I'm gonna take your question away from you, but we were just chatting about this, and she was sort of suggesting to look at it at a country level where preference for gender may be different from one country to the next. I would have liked, I have also some detailed questions, but I don't think we need to go into them right now. The US sample, so what I thought was really striking is how high the numbers are in the US sample. And then I went down this Google rabbit hole of trying to find data on acceptance of violence in the US and could not find anything, which I assume is maybe why you actually collected your own data. So there's no DHS in developed countries. So I couldn't find anything. If you have a source of data on that, I would be really interested to find it. But the acceptance of violence seems so high that I had I had some trouble believing it, and I was wondering what it was about your sample, your data collection methodology that led to that, and whether that may be somehow correlated to to this mechanism between the gender of the children and the preference for the acceptance of violence. So I think if you're gonna make a paper, if you want to do this paper that has both of these regions in it, it would be important to really underline what are the differences in the data collection strategy and why one may be, it's an internet sample, and an internet survey may have really different response rates in terms of social desirability bias. So that's something that would really need to be discussed. Yeah, and then I had just a couple more like terminology things. So one is that I wouldn't call this cultural attitudes. I would call it acceptance of violence or gender attitudes, but I wouldn't call it cultural attitudes. And a second one was in the paper, there's discussion on bargaining power, but the variables that are used are actually decision-making variables, which are more a consequence of bargaining power than a proxy for bargaining power. So I would make sure not to mix up the different concepts. Otherwise, yeah, I really look forward to reading the next version of the paper, and I'll send you a few more detailed comments, or maybe I will in the next version. If you want to send me the next version, I would be really happy to read it. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia, for those comments. I hope you have taken them. Yes. You have something to say?
Oh,
was that Willa?
Oh, I just said thanks.
Oh, she's muted.
Sorry.
But I would like to welcome Marlene. Marlene?
yes.
Yes,
I-
Marlene. Just before you give your comments, Marlene, there are a few quick points. For the first paper on psychosocial and economic impacts, it's the part that emphasizes the results showing that when this care is given by non-professionals, when it's delivered by non-professionals, it seems to have an impact more than when it's actually delivered by, like, we can't really rely on the professionals. It's better the way it's pointing to relying on non-professionals. My concern is, what are those key characteristics of non-health professionals that drives this kind of impact? What are those characteristics? How do they differ from the professionals that causes this kind of impact? What are those things that we can look at? And then for the third paper, which talks about evolution of cultural attitudes and gender of children, one of my concerns is just that cultural attitudes seem to be quite inelastic over a very long period of time. So the period that you're studying it, could it be that's the reason why we don't see any major impact? Because this is something that is can be quite inelastic, and the cultural perceptions are very embedded. For example, you find people giving examples that if my husband does not beat me, then probably he does not love me. So how are you going to talk about intimate partner violence being something that should not be a norm for such a person if that's how they perceive it? So what are those deeply seated perceptions that drive or could explain this kind of results? So on that note, I'd like to welcome Marlene. Marlene works at the Population Reference Bureau, and she's also been very instrumental in putting together the conference, reading through the abstracts, and just everything that we've done as a whole team. You're most welcome, Marlene.
Thank you, Esther. I really wanted to ask attendees that might have questions, if they cannot put it in the question and answer box, to see if they can write the questions in the chat box. I don't know if they have access to chat. And while we're waiting on that, I'll just add a couple of questions to myself and we can start having the authors respond. For the first paper on the narrative exposure therapy, my main question as I read that, if I got it right, you didn't see, am I correct that the therapy did not have an effect when delivered by health professionals? And if I am correct, isn't that very concerning, unless it was designed only to have an effect by someone from your community? Then on the paper with employment and IPV, I had a question about the different occupations that men and women had in your sample. And I wondered if the finding of the effect on women of the dust storms is because women are mainly doing market work and traveling, and maybe men have more diverse set of employment. On the paper that's about mothers and fathers and the sons and daughters, my question there was the extent to which one is allowed to have diverse opinions in different cultures, because maybe what you hear from people in West Africa is what they're supposed to say, or the prevalent opinion, whereas in the US, people are more inclined to give their own opinion as opposed to what's the norm in their setting. So that was mine. And why don't we start with in the middle? Why don't we start with Kabore on responding to the comments on employment and intimate partner violence?
Yes, Marlene, thank you. So your question was, and Alev also talked about it on discussing the occupation between men and women, to the point that why does pollution affect women more than men? Yes, it's the underlying issue there is it's the occupation that most women are doing in West Africa. They're selling in the markets, and when unexpected dust pollution happen and the flow of the dust is more than the usual, people don't normally go to buy those merchandise, whether it's food that they're selling or condiments. It's not that they're not going to show up, but since they're selling services, the buyers are not coming, and that affects their income. Men's occupations, most of them are doing agricultural work. And for agricultural work, unexpected dust pollution really doesn't affect them much. They go maybe early in the morning, they water their crops, and most of the day, there's really not much to do. So it's their work rather than women's providing services and having people come to buy. So that's the main difference that I've seen between men's occupation and women's occupation. And the other questions was, policy recommendations from Alev. Yes, if there are short terms, normally people provide help when there are famines or conflicts. But my argument in this paper is that the short-term effect of women's economic outcomes, such as employment or short-term incomes, need to be taken into account, because they can end up widening the gender gap or even affecting the experiences of intimate partner violence. So maybe government can come up with insurance policies whereby in the short run, when dust pollution or maybe rainfall, it affects women's ability to work, that they have help. Another thing is to also look at, as I was mentioned in the paper, is continue to invest in education and provide more access to capital and program training, so that we can diversify women's occupation in a way that they wouldn't be overly represented in occupation that are vulnerable to this type of environmental condition or even climate change as they come in the future.
Thank you.
Okay, okay. Cool.
We'll come back to you if
Okay.
I'll go to Julia and Alev and Leah. You had some questions about the community-based results, and I think the literature.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I think I agree that our big finding and contribution is that net seems to really work much better when it's delivered by non-health professionals. There's a couple reasons why we are a little bit tentative when we say that. One of them is that, well, our sample is incomplete in line. The second one is that we can't control for self-selection into getting therapy with the non-professional health worker and getting therapy at a health center. We're still trying to find ways to do that. The way the project was structured is that initially NET was supposed to be delivered only in health centers. by nurses and trained health professionals. And then there were a whole lot of institutional issues with how much they would be paid to deliver those therapies, and then they weren't getting paid, and there were huge bottlenecks and huge delays. And so after a while, the project that was implementing NET decided to try and do NET through community-based organizations. And then that's when the psychosocial assistants were trained. And so we don't completely know when, at that moment when the CBOs become available for NET, we don't completely know why women are getting the therapy at CBOs and why they're getting it at the health center, and they can be referred in both directions. So it's very hard to disentangle this. So that's one of the reasons that we still think that given the big difference in coefficient, even if there's self-selection, it probably still holds. And it probably still holds, but we need to do more work on that. I think the question of whether, isn't it concerning that it doesn't work when it's delivered by health professionals? Yes, it's super concerning. Whether that's, again, this institutional problem of the healthcare professionals not being adequately motivated, as they say, basically remunerated for their additional efforts in delivering the therapy, or, whether that is that, or whether it's like a characteristic inherent to the health professionals, we can't really know. But Esther did suggest looking at characteristics of counselors, which we haven't actually done yet, and we don't have the detailed data, but we could go back and collect more data on the counselors to see whether there are differences, maybe just in age, in education level, and last thing, in community-based organizations, the psychosocial assistants are paid to do this work. The NGO that trained them and supervises them sort of purchases the narratives that come out of the therapies, so they are paid. And the healthcare professionals were supposed to be paid. In the end, I don't know exactly which one of these two costs the most. So for sure, through CBOs, it's quite scalable because it's somewhat easier to find psychosocial assistants, train them, and supervise them to actually deliver the therapy. It doesn't mean it's necessarily cheaper, but I think that's also some more work that we need to do to figure that out. Thank you.
Thank you. And Willa, any final? Sorry.
Maybe would I add something to Julia, what Julia has just talked about? Have you also explored the perception about mental health in general, about mental health? Because maybe the recipients don't consider going to the health centers, thinking that it's not really something that should be treated at the health centers. And that's why it becomes more effective when it's delivered to them within the community. Within the community, they probably perceive it as someone is just giving you some advice and you're just interacting. It's not necessarily a health condition. Could you also consider that maybe it can help to explain some of the variation that we see? Yeah, so you're welcome, Marlene.
Sure.
Marlene, you're welcome.
Thank you. And Willa, any last comment on your paper?
Thanks for those comments. Thanks for the vocab. As you can see from reading this is a new area for me. And so there are a lot of things I'm still remembering to try to call it IPV instead of domestic violence. So I'm really out of date on this stuff. So splitting by country is a great idea. So actually Jean has been working on this already this week, is splitting by ethnic groups, splitting by region of country to try to see if there are some areas where we're seeing different results. And specifically one thing we've been thinking about is, are there areas where there's less polygamy? And so then the threat of your husband taking another wife because you've had too many girls is going to be a different thing in areas like that. Unfortunately, there don't seem to be too many. I shouldn't say unfortunately. There are not as many areas in West Africa that have low enough polygamy rates to do that, but we can sort of, this is absolutely the next step. In terms of like the comparison between the two, this project has sort of come together in a very weird way, where first we had the West Africa stuff. John was showing me these results and I wasn't really ready to believe that there was actually nothing there. And I assumed it was, of course, there's going to be this big gap and we're going to find that. And maybe we should get some US audience interested in this. So let's do this US survey. And so it made sense sort of putting them together when I was very sure that we were going to find the same things. But it wasn't really meant to be a comparison of like, why are the two places different? And so I think we might need to like pull it apart into two different things. But I am enjoying putting it together and asking people to come up with their ideas about why we are seeing such different things. But it has come together in a very strange way. Anyway, thank you so much for these. This has been great.
Kabori, did we have an unanswered question that you wanted to answer? Okay.
Sure.
Well, I really enjoyed this session and I learned a lot, and I want to thank the panelists for their enthusiasm and hard work. I know that we can continue discussion in our Meet the Authors room. You should have a link to that. If you would like, the authors would like to go there. Maybe there are people that went to another session who would like to come and ask you some questions. So it would be great if you could show up for a few minutes there. Esther, anything else?
No, nothing much to add, except that you're welcome to the Meet the Authors session, which should begin in about 4 minutes time. So please join in if you have the time and just keep interacting. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you so much, Marlene, for moderating. And thank you for the guys in the background who are helping us with the support. Yes, thank you for joining in. I think we'll sign off for now. Bye for now.
Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks
Thank
all
you.
the organizers. Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.